Thank you, Mr President. I seek leave to make a brief explanation before addressing a question to the Minister for Health and Wellbeing on a coronavirus vaccine.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Thank you, Mr President. The federal government has announced some $66 million towards finding a coronavirus COVID-19 vaccine. I know that the Honourable Frank Pangello locally has put himself up to be the very first test guinea pig. My question to the Minister for Health and Wellbeing, though, is what steps are we taking to ensure whatever vaccine is first discovered and works is made publicly accessible and available to the most South Australians and Australians possible?
Yeah, I thank the honourable member for her question, and I'd make 3 points. I think it's really important that we don't predicate our strategies on the basis that a vaccine will become available anytime soon. That's why we are taking extraordinary measures in Australia to suppress the transmission of the disease. The other point I'd make is that the same values that have driven the Australian response to suppressing the virus will be the same values we take to the issue of distribution of vaccines. Australia has not only a universal healthcare system, but in our response to the pandemic, we have demonstrated Australian values of care for those who are most vulnerable. I'd particularly highlight the work of my colleague, the Honourable Michelle Lensink, in relation to providing services to homeless people. For example, South Australians who are refugees, do not have Medicare, will still get free coronavirus testing. In terms of the rollout of all of our strategies, I believe that the Australian communities, of whatever political persuasion, have demonstrated Australian values of standing up for those most vulnerable. And also, to be frank, in the context of a public health crisis, it is fundamentally self-interest to make sure that the vulnerable are looked after, because the person you pass in the street might be the person who transmit COVID to you. And so it's in your personal interest that everybody is supported and protected. The honourable member particularly highlights the challenge in relation to vaccines. And again, Australian values are reflected in the National Immunisation Program, which is particularly targeting the vulnerable. I'm sure that the same values will be reflected in the vaccination program. We certainly need to make sure that as a vaccine becomes available, it is only made available when it's safe to do so. And I think one of the challenges going forward would be there will be some who will want to take risks on vaccines. And I would strongly be one of those arguing that we can't afford to take risk with vaccines. Not only would it threaten those who might be receiving a vaccine that is not safe to use, but it risks undermining the ongoing support of the community for vaccination programs. So we need to make sure that it's rolled out in a timely way, that it's rolled out in an equitable way. Now, that doesn't mean that people that have a vaccine for coronavirus can only be available through the national program. So, for example, influenza, we make sure we look after vulnerable South Australians and Australians through the National Immunisation Program and through some limited state-funded programs, but also people who are able to afford to buy the vaccine actually self-fund it. So I certainly expect that as a vaccine is identified, as it's made available in Australia, Australian governments will do what they've done in the early stages of this pandemic. They'll continue to operate in accordance with Australian values, which are also liberal values. In fact, I would argue that the Liberal Party embodies the Australian values. And now that you taunt me, now that you taught me, I'm reminded that this is the party that has served the longest term of government in the federal sphere, demonstrating that not only I believe that it reflects Australian values, the Australian people believe it respects Australian values. And please don't hector me. I don't want to keep preaching about how much I love the Liberal Party.
Order.
So going back to the honourable member's question, I think I'm completely resonating with the honourable member's aspirations, and that is that any vaccination program is fair and promotes the public health of all Australians.